The inexcusable failure of them all is not only shameful, it is scandalous and it is immoral. They have grossly failed their ethical standards by abusing people's human rights.
How could it happen? How could it have been overlooked? And why did no one take responsibility afterwards? From the Stafford Hospital scandal to Harold Shipman, Gosport is another massive health service tragedy that'll be remembered for years to come.
456 patients died through prescribing and administering opioids without medical justification. It is not for the panel to ascribe criminal and civil liability. It will be for any future judicial processes to determine whatever culpability and criticism might then be forthcoming.
We'll hear from the son of one patient who died after a prescribed overdose of pain-killing drugs, from a nurse who worked there.
Did you ever raise your concerns with anybody? Did you talk to anybody about it?
Only with my own colleagues on my ward. I'm ashamed to say we didn't.
We'll ask the General Medical Council why they didn't strike off Dr. Jane Barton. And we'll ask, is there some way to apply effective checks and balances into the system? Hello. It was 27 years ago that nurses at Gosport War Memorial Hospital reported concerns about the inappropriate prescribing of diamorphine, aka heroin. Well, today we have finally a clear factual account of the horror to which they were witness. Under the supervision of Dr. Jane Barton, lethal doses of painkillers were given to patients, many of whom were without pain. On the best evidence, 650 patients may have had their lives brought to an early end by the inappropriate use of opioids. 650. After years of pressure for a proper investigation from the families of patients, the Gosport Independent Panel has now painstakingly been through more than 1,000 medical records and found those apparent premature deaths between 1989 and 2000. There was actually a surge in deaths at the hospital in the 90s and a surge in the reporting of bronchopneumonia deaths, and yet somehow it all went unnoticed. Not quite. It was reported, but not stopped. Because it raises so many questions, we're giving most of our programme to it tonight. But we'll start with Katie Razzle, who is in Portsmouth, where today's report was published. Katie.
Well, Evan, this morning, after the families had had some time to look at it, we were given this, a 370-page report. And I have to say, however prepared I was based on my knowledge of this story, it was shocking to read. Not just the disregard for human life, as it's put, but also the systemic failings at the hospital, which failed to heed warnings from nurses, failed to properly investigate, through to the police, whose investigations were considered consistently poor and who always failed to consider the risk to patients, the ongoing risk to patients, to the coroner, who should have looked at more cases. Now, this report says that the families are entitled to ask how this could have happened. They get some of those answers. They certainly don't get answers as to why it happened, nor from this do they get justice or accountability, which is what they've been fighting so long for. Now, many of them were here. They spent hours inside the cathedral this morning, going through the report, being briefed by the bishop, who was the chair of the panel. And I know from talking to them afterwards, there were lots of tears. This was a very emotional day for many people.
They found out a lot of things, and it's all going to come out now, which I'm glad about.
I'm glad somebody's going to get their comeuppance. It's about time.
But it hasn't stopped here, and it won't stop here. We'll carry on until we get this to the right point, you know, where something should be done about it.
For nearly 20 years, these families have been treated as troublemakers. Today, they came to Portsmouth Cathedral for answers about what happened to their loved ones in the hospital just across the water from here in Gosport.
I said he was all right when I left him yesterday, and you're telling me he could be dead in bed while we're talking. She said, well, he hasn't got long to live. And he was admitted on the 14th.
14th, yeah.
And he died on the 18th.
Gillian Kimbley's husband, Robert Wilson, died in Gosport War Memorial Hospital in 1998. He's one of 5 cases where an inquest ruled prescribed drugs contributed to their deaths.
She gave far, far too much out. I could see it in his bed. You know, this syringe thing, you know, this thing that was just pushing it into him.
The independent panel's report is shocking. It says more than 450 lives were shortened at the hospital, with potentially another 200 more such deaths in cases where records are missing. The report described a disregard for human life and a culture of shortening lives with dangerous doses of morphine.
The relatives have shown remarkable tenacity and fortitude in questioning what happened to their loved ones. The documents explained and published today show that they were right to ask those questions.
The Bishop's panel looked at practices at Gosport War Memorial Hospital between 1989 and 2000. For years, families had complained about the treatment of their elderly relatives who died here. Despite 3 police investigations, a Department of Health audit, inquests into a handful of the deaths, and a General Medical Council investigation, it's taken until now for the truth to emerge, that there was an institutionalised regime of prescribing medication that wasn't clinically justified.
We went into War Memorial to recuperate, that was all.
Pauline Godley says her 82-year-old father, Arthur Cousins, was sent to the hospital after an operation.
3 days before he was going to get discharged and come home, he sat in the chair there and he said, Pauline, he said, please tell him not to pump any more morphine. He knew what they were pumping in. It's doing my head in.
That's what he said?
Yes, it's doing my head in. But since that day, I felt so guilty. And today, as I say, I had a cry in there, you know, about it. But it still hits me. You can't help it. I've had to live with that. And at last, hopefully, we're going to get satisfaction, because all these years have gone by, and that's what I want at the end. Satisfaction to know the right people are going to get their uppance, hopefully.
Dr. Jane Barton, a GP who worked part-time as a clinical assistant at the hospital, was responsible for the practice of prescribing on wards throughout this period. She's previously denied wrongdoing and maintains she always acted in the best interests of patients. Much later, in 2010, the General Medical Council found her guilty of multiple instances of serious professional misconduct. She wasn't struck off, and she chose to retire straight after. Today, Newsnight met Betty Mears, who worked at Gosport on a different ward. The former staff nurse was sometimes called on, along with other colleagues, to countersign when Dr. Barton prescribed controlled drugs.
If one of Dr. Barton's patients came onto our ward, we did say, and to my shame, and a lot of the people who worked at the War Memorial Hospital should feel the same as me, we had reservations about the way that some of her patients were medicated.
And did you raise any of your concerns at the time? Did you talk to anybody
Only
about
with
it?
my own colleagues on my ward. I'm ashamed to say we didn't. You know, why I have questioned that in myself. Because we did say, oh, you know, patient Dr. Barton's coming in, and we hoped that she wouldn't put them on anything too heavy.
Even if Betty had spoken out, it's likely she wouldn't have been listened to if the findings in this report are anything to go by. All the way back in 1991, a nurse first raised concerns from night staff about the use of opioids. The hospital ignored those warnings. In doing so, this report says, deaths resulted. The documents handed over by those nurses were hidden away for more than a decade, which meant when the police and the General Medical Council began to investigate the hospital, neither authority was told that nurses had first flagged this up years before.
Nothing I say today will lessen the anguish and pain of families who have campaigned for 20 years for justice after the loss of a loved one. But I can, at least on behalf of the government and the NHS, apologise for what happened and what they have been through.
Despite what families may think, the report says there isn't evidence to support collusion or conspiracy, but it doesn't offer up any answers as to why these drugs were overprescribed. And you obviously choose your language very carefully, but looking at it, reading it, institutional practice of shortening lives through the wrong use of opioids, it looks like people being killed.
And I have to choose my words. Why? Because of what might follow, because nothing that I say must affect what proceeds. And if there is to be justice beyond this, then we all need to be very circumspect.
For Gillian Mackenzie, the woman whose complaint to the police about her mother's death started the long journey to this point, only criminal proceedings will satisfy.
It's about time, to put it mildly, and they'll have to look at it in more detail. They'll have to bring 15 of the strongest cases into the criminal court, because that's where it deserves to go, whether that's my case or not. And as far as I'm concerned, they've got to get a conviction for all the rest of the families who also have a genuine case.
Katie Razzle reporting there. Well, Hampshire Police said today that it would take the time to read the findings carefully and that it would assess any new information in conjunction with the Crown Prosecution Service. And the local NHS Trust said that the debt we owe to those families is to meticulously review the contents of the report and to take whatever action is required to prevent such a situation from occurring again. Well, I'm joined now by David Huntington, whose father, Robert Wilson, died aged 74 at Gosport War Memorial Hospital in 1998, having been admitted with a shoulder injury. And David, you can never have imagined that would, that trip into the hospital would be his last.
No, well, he walked into the hospital after having gone through recovery for the shoulder operation. He was doing well. He should have walked out of the hospital.
And how quickly did things happen when he was in there?
Literally the day he went in the evening, there were calls made to various members of my family that we should be going back because he had indeed slipped into a coma.
Right. And had he been aware of mistreatment that he was getting there?
His final words to my brother Ian, it was my brother Ian that was really a thorn in the side of the people that were investigating this in the public inquiries. Unfortunately, Ian died 3 years ago. But his last words to my brother Ian were, "Son, they're killing me."
So he was aware that something wasn't right. We should say your father's the gentleman on the left of the pictures there.
Yeah.
How did the family react straight after? You've had this shocking, rapid death after a complete surprise. Did you think nature was taking its course, or were you immediately very suspicious?
Not at all. I mean, it was very, very confusing what was going on because it wasn't the result we were expecting. We were expecting him to come out and for life to carry on. And so when we were given this news, we had family fly in from different parts of the world to come and pay their last respects, which just seemed an odd thing to do. My sister Leslie came over from America. She sat down and chatted with him. She got up to go and get a cup of coffee. When she came back, he was dead.
I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. How quickly were you, as a family, feeling we need to investigate here? This is something clearly that the hospital may have killed him. This should not have happened.
It was right from the off. I mean, I'm the youngest of 7. And after that, the sort of family getting together, there were a lot of conversations that were, that could be described as arguments. We were all very upset at what had gone on, and it was clear from the get-go that it wasn't right.
Right. So take us through the steps you took thereafter, because it has been a long, long journey to where we are today. Because you were rebuffed, essentially, weren't you? Your brother, particularly, was trying to make to say this isn't right, what's going to happen now? And they were saying, don't make a fuss, more or less. Is that how it was?
Absolutely. I mean, again, as I say, it was Ian that was really the driving force behind making a noise, sort of talking to the police.
So you went to the police, you went to the hospital authorities first?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there was the first time we all got together for it was when a legal firm decided to become involved.
Okay.
And we later found out that it was the same legal company that had investigated the Shipman case.
Right.
And so that was when we knew that something definitely wasn't right, because people were starting to hear our voice, and it wasn't just our family. But lots of families, roomfuls of people that had concerns that something wasn't right, that were continually sort of ignored.
I mean, it is interesting. One of the findings of the report today is that there's no evidence of cover-up or collusion between all the different authorities that sort of messed up in this whole ghastly affair. You presumably were thinking it felt like we were being rebuffed on it wasn't working on so many layers. It did feel like collusion, presumably.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the report revealed today that indeed the police and the health authorities in the original investigation were talking to each other prior to making anything public. And if that isn't collusion, then I don't know what is.
How does it feel to have it all out in the open now? I mean, clearly the facts are there now.
Well, it's a good result. It's a good result for everybody involved, and I think that. But this is again just the beginning of another process.
And that process is
hopefully a criminal investigation, hopefully justice for all the families, so that we can grieve, so that we can put this aside, and move on. It's been 20 years.
Yeah. David, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming in. Well, don't judge a system just by whether things go wrong. Of course they will. There'll be some incompetence or evil everywhere. But you can judge a system by how it deals with those things. And that is the focus of much of the report today. How it was not stopped, how accountability was lost. Our policy editor, Chris Cook, takes a look at just how many chances to deal with the problem were missed.
Please make comfortable. That's the deadly euphemism at the heart of the Gosport report, released today. But a damning feature of its findings is that staff complained about the hospital's prescribing, and families raised the alarm. But the problem was only really taken in hand once rumours reached the desk of the Chief Medical Officer in Whitehall. The documents released today show how nurses were worrying about opiate use in the hospital from 1988. In July 1991, things came to a head. There was a meeting with 11 people present, 10 nurses, 1 manager. The nurses were clear. The main area for concern was the use of diamorphine on patients, which the majority had concerns about. Not all patients given diamorphine have pain. Patients' deaths are sometimes hastened unnecessarily. But in reply, the manager present, Mrs. Evans, said it was medical practice they were questioning. That wasn't within her power to control. A culture of medical deference, not evidence-based practice.
I think we've recognised that frontline staff actually know what's going on. They're there day to day. And if you have a culture in an organisation, which we often have, you know, highlighted by mid-staffs, highlighted by Morecambe Bay, where there is this pressure to manage reputations and to prioritise the reputation of the organisation.
Their warnings were well grounded and well considered, but the hospital didn't act on them. It acted against them. In December 1991, the Nurses Union rep wrote, "The concerns of the nurses were now being treated by managers as allegations, and since highlighting their concerns, there has been a certain amount of ostracisation." After that 1991 intervention, the nurses were quietened. If only they hadn't been. The review tracked the number of uses of morphine without sufficient evidence. In 1991, the numbers were still relatively modest compared with what was to come. After that, it took off. Hundreds of patients were given unnecessary opiates. Dr. Barton signed 854 death certificates, and of the patients she treated, 94% had received opiates, with little evidence that she sought to use the gentlest painkillers possible. Family members sought to raise the alarm, but from the outside, it's hard to piece together the puzzle. In 1998, the death of Gladys Richards sparked a police inquiry when her daughters sought an investigation. Police interest was drawn into the question of whether Dr. Barton was right to treat Mrs. Richards without a drip, rather than questions about opiate prescribing. They also botched the case, asking the hospital for advice in their investigation into one of the hospital's doctors. But a chain of investigations had now begun. Barton resigned her post as a clinical assistant in 2000, but other cases started emerging and being linked together. By 2001, the health authorities, primary care groups, trusts, the regional office of the NHS Executive, the Commission for Healthcare Improvement and the Department of Health all knew there was a problem.
So I think the shocking thing about the report is these families were raising very serious concerns, and all the different organisations, from the local trust to the regulator to the GMC to the NMC to the local MP to the coroner, all of them didn't act on what these families were saying. I think it was the alignment of this is too much of a problem, we don't want to deal with this, it's much easier if this issue went away. Really kind of exemplified by the quote from the police officer who met two of the families involved, and then was quoted as saying, you know, why are these two women intent on causing trouble?
It was Sir Liam Donaldson, who was then the chief medical officer, who eventually broke the silence. He'd heard this second-hand report that a nurse had described the hospital as having a culture of euthanasia, and he wanted proper answers. So he asked Richard Baker, who'd investigated the Harold Shipman case, to look into Gosport. His report came back in 2003. It wasn't till 2013, though, that it was finally published.
The instruction from the Department of Health was that their lawyers thought it would be inappropriate to publish the report because of ongoing investigations, the coroner's inquests. There were police investigations in some of the earlier years. There was a GMC investigation, and it wasn't published until the final coroner's inquest had taken place. This is 2013.
The eventual publication of that report triggered the inquiry, but no one was struck off or prosecuted in the meantime. Not Dr. Barton, nor the consultants and pharmacists who knew how she worked. It took 5 years from the initial police complaint from a family for proper investigation, and now 20 to grasp the scale of the problem.
Chris Cook. Well, the chair of the independent panel, the Right Reverend James Jones, had led a similar investigation into the Hillsborough disaster, again one that was the result of the pressure from the families of those who had died. He drew a comparison today between Gosport and Hillsborough and pointed out his report on the latter was called The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. His words, not mine. As you heard, many authorities have huge questions to answer. Layers of failing are being exposed. Among them, the General Medical Council, who failed to strike Jane Barton off when a fitness to practice panel heard her case in 2010. Now, in fairness, the GMC did loudly disagree with its own panel finding there, but many failures were evident. I spoke to Anthony Omo, the Director of Fitness to Practice at the GMC now, and I asked if his organisation accepts there was massive failing of the system of public protection for which they are responsible.
We accept that the report makes hard reading. Today is about the families, and we hope that the panel's report does provide them with the answers that they seek. There has been a failure. We have to accept that, and we apologise for that.
And you accept the report as a good description of the sequence of events?
I think we do accept the report, and we accept that what it describes should never have happened.
The amazing thing in the report is that in 2010, a panel, one of your panels, Fitness to Practice panel, found multiple instances of serious professional misconduct and decided not to strike her off the medical register. Now, have you worked out why or how that could be?
So I think you'll recognise that we publicly, for the first time I think in our history, disagreed with the decision of the panel. Our chief executive at the time went public in saying that we disagreed. We called for her to be struck off. Dr. Barton failed her patients and their families and should have been struck off. At the time, the panels were part of the GMC and we didn't have a right of appeal. The panels are now separate as an independent tribunal, and we do now have a right of appeal, which we have exercised where we have disagreed that the panel's decision protects patients. So we will take action now to appeal decisions which we don't think protect the public.
But, I mean, the other feature that was so remarkable is how long it took. So eventually, the panel that didn't strike her off was 19 years after the first complaints from relatively junior staff about the prescribing going on. 10 years after the GMC is alerted to the problem and starts to think about it. 10 years. How can it take so long?
We agree that it took far too long, and for that we're sorry. We were hampered by initially the police investigation, and they asked us not to investigate so as not to prejudice their investigation, and then subsequently by the coroners, and we had to wait for that. When the police are investigating and they ask you to hold your investigation, it would be wrong not to do so. Of course, we didn't realise at the time they were going to have 3 goes at it. Now we work much more closely with the police.
Do you think, when you read the report, that families were right to worry that on the council of the GMC was Jane Barton's brother?
I think we could have been clearer with the families about the role that Jane Barton's brother played or did not play. He clearly did not play any role in the investigation or the hearing. No council members did from 2004 onwards. But we could have been clearer with the family about what role he did and didn't play.
When you look back at this and the sort of litany of problems, the consultants weren't investigated, the time it took, the fact she wasn't struck off, the fact the interim orders panels didn't choose to bar her temporarily at least, it all adds up. Can you not see? It just seems to add up to something really systematic about protection of the workforce rather than listening to the families.
I can understand the family's concern there, and I think we share that. I think the report shows we did do what we could do at the time. Clearly the system...
You're not saying you would behave the same way given what you now know. I mean, that would...
No. There are clearly lessons to be learned, and there are lessons we will learn. What I am saying is that we have taken some of those lessons to heart. We know we could do better, and we will do better. The system of regulation has changed in the last 10 years, and that has been some of the learning. As I said, part of it is better clinical governance, which allows us to have real-time information, which allows us to act quicker.
Speculate for me on why there seemed to be this closing of ranks and why nothing was done about what is now just an absolutely enormous scandal.
I think for our part, and our panel, when it did find Jane Barton guilty of serious professions, found that she had failed her patients in a number of ways. I can't speculate further. I mean, we do need to consider the report. There's a lot in there, and there may be action that follows from it. So I think it'd be wrong for me to speculate about what happened at the time.
Are you confident that if this happened again, it would be dealt with more quickly and more effectively?
I'm more confident that we have better relationship with the police, that we have better powers than we did back in the day, that we have a closer understanding and working with the local system so that we have real-time information coming to us when concerns arise, that we now have a professional duty of candour, that we have guidance on raising and acting consent. So we have improved clinical governance, which all adds up to a better way of regulation.
Anthony Omo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The view from the GMC. Well, let's take a look at how we get to these disasters. One important thing the report said today is this: the documents the panel has reviewed do not contain evidence in support of such collusion or conspiracy. They show that the underlying explanation is the tendency of individuals and organisations, when faced with serious allegations, to handle them in a way that limits the impact on the organisation and its perceived reputation. Well, joining me now from Birmingham is former Health Secretary Stephen Dorrell, who's now chair of the NHS Confederation. And here in the studio, a clinical negligence lawyer, Suzanne White, and Professor Gary Ford, a consultant who provided expert reports on this case to the police and the General Medical Council. A very good evening to you all. Stephen Dorrell, you were Health Secretary in the 1990s. Would you put this down to a cultural problem that existed within the NHS?
Well, I think, first of all, the first thing to say is that this is an appalling and shocking story. And anybody who's been anywhere close to the healthcare system over that 20-year period owes the families an apology and a recognition that it's no good saying we did our best or it was understandable. The truth is the system failed. And we need to turn around, face that fact, and ask ourselves what we can do to ensure that we minimise the risk of it happening again. And I think it is partly a result of the instinct, because the health service is a massively popular organisation, it does massively good work most of the time. There is a tendency for those who work in the healthcare system to think they did their best. Well, on this occasion, their best was nowhere near good enough.
and we have to find ways of getting to that conclusion when it arises much more quickly and in a much more responsive way, in a way that listens to the patients and to their families rather than justifying our own actions.
Let me just pin you down a little bit on the culture issue, because I just want to know what exactly you think the culture issue is. Is it deference, so nurses don't want to challenge doctors? Is it doctors wanting to protect doctors? Is it something about no one looking at data? Is it an attitude to whistleblowers that basically no one blows the whistle because they think they'll be punished by the management? Just give me in 3 sentences what you think it is.
Well, I think there are 2 things of the list. I think there's an element of truth in everything you said. There are 2 that I'd particularly focus on. One is we need to be much better at looking quickly at the data in order to understand what's going on in an individual part of the healthcare system quickly. And the second thing is that I think it's critical that we rediscover the importance of professional discipline. You talked about the GMC, the Bishop also talked about nurses and pharmacists all knowing what was going on. It calls to mind the words of the person who did an inquiry into the Bristol scandal nearly 30 years ago now. He said, the real scandal of the cases like this is not that nobody knows, it is that everybody knows. That's the scandal.
Okay. Let me put those points then to 2 guests in the studio. Suzanne White, I mean, do you feel, as a lawyer, and you're involved in many of these cases, do you feel a culture problem? Is it culture, or is it, would you sort of put a different word to it?
Well, first thing to say, it's a very dark day today for patient safety and patient care. My heart absolutely goes out to the families, but yes, I think there is a cultural problem. The longevity of this, the numbers of patients involved, you've got right from the outset, nurses complaining, families complaining and concerns raised, and a report done in 2003 which is ignored for 10 years. Then we have inquests, only 11 inquests. There's 833 patients we're concerned about here. And then, you know, the GMC findings, which didn't strike off the doctor. It just has gone on forever. It beggars belief, and I think there is a real cultural problem, yes.
Gary, you were actually early on to this. You were warning the police that there was something afoot in 2000, 2001. What do you put it down to? I don't want to hear again what the problem is. I want to hear sort of a laser-sharp analysis of what the cultural dysfunction is, if it is one.
So I think one needs to sort of be clear that the NHS does not have a single culture. There are some excellent organisations. So let's be clear. You know, we can point to organisations where they really are leading in terms of thinking about improvement and quality and how teams work. So I think I was shocked today by what I saw. I'd initially, as you're indicating, had reviewed 5 deaths at the request of the Hampshire Police and then looked at 12 deaths in the GMC fitness to practice inquiry. But I think it was really shocking to see, first of all, that concerns were first expressed in 1991, and then the sheer number of patients who died receiving opiates without a clinical indication.
We're all amazed that much could be going on with there no sort of, you know, the way that a credit card company finds out there's something funny happening on your credit card. It wasn't a red flag coming up.
I and other experts raised serious concerns about culture and the senior management and involvement of clinicians when we just saw a limited number of cases. So it was recognised very early on. I think in terms of thinking about this problem, there's 2 levels. There's first, how do healthcare professionals work and respond and think about the quality of their care, and how they respond to complaints, comments, criticisms from both patients and other healthcare professionals.
If they're too defensive, it gets worse, not better.
So good teams have, in their leaders, in the senior healthcare professionals, they set models where they are open and seek comment, criticism, and you look at patient complaints as an opportunity to improve your service, not as something to get away. And I do think many parts of the service have changed in their thinking and the way they look at that. I think there's also a need to look at teams and how they function and all that. The second level, though, is the organisational response, which was clearly problematic, and it is difficult to know exactly what went on. My impression, having read some of the report today, is
individual organisations weren't clear about what their role was and what they should do, and were
felt like
looking to others.
Too many of them were also passing.
So I think there are two separate issues that need addressing.
Okay, let me put back to Suzanne. Do you think it's better now? You see, you mentioned the culture problem in the present tense, and we're talking about something from 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that I don't think it does, and that's not my experience. And I heard the GMC chap talking there about lessons learned. Well, lessons learned are always the line that comes out after this. And I think if I was a family today hearing lessons will be learned, I'm not going to be convinced after Mid Staffordshire, after Ian Patterson, and now this. I mean, the numbers involved is just astonishing.
And you see it still. I mean,
yeah,
you're
I think we were talking recently about a case that a doctor had contacted me and said I can't possibly say anything about the care that's happened, but I'm telling you now, off the record, that was the most appalling care that I've
What's
seen.
the role of lawyers in this? Because some people think there's too much litigation, but maybe there isn't enough litigation. Maybe, I don't know whether this would happen in America, maybe when you have a really litigious culture, people really watch what's going on.
Well, there isn't a litigious culture. There's over, in the region of 1 million medical accidents a year, and very few people actually have access to justice and actually bring cases against the NHS. A very, very small minority. So that's not the case. In fact, I think there's not enough access to justice for patients, and particularly cases like this with the elderly, and also which are potentially low-value cases. Those are the cases that are really going to be affected. And
let me put to Stephen Dorrell. Stephen Dorrell, do you think it is significantly better now? Because if it is culture, one might think it hasn't changed very much. It's the same institution.
I do think the institutions have changed a bit. I think the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, is a much more effective machinery for looking at outcomes achieved than was the case 20 years ago. I do also think, although the GMC has a lot of questions to answer in this case, the GMC and indeed the professional regulatory structure has changed somewhat. But can I just pick up the point that was just made of a doctor saying that he didn't want to make he didn't want to raise a particular concern that's just referred to. I think that flies absolutely in the face of what I understand professional obligation to be. Those of us who are not professionally qualified look to the professions as the way that you deliver high quality healthcare. And I think it's essential that the professions, by which I mean doctors, nursing, pharmacists, the regulated professions, read their own guides.
It's an obligation,
to practice.
it's not a favour you're doing somebody.
Well, it's a collective ownership of standards within the profession.
We need to live there. Thank you. Some really interesting points by all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, in other news, the